Welcome to the Serial Killer Files, the podcast that delves deep into the psychological evolution of history's most notorious figures. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're exploring one of the most chilling transformations in criminal history. How a boy born as no-name Maddox became Charles Manson, the cult leader who orchestrated some of the most shocking murders of the 20th century. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a psychological autopsy of evil itself, a journey through the twisted pathways that led from abandonment and abuse to manipulation and murder. We'll trace the precise moments, influences, and experiences that shaped a monster, revealing how institutional failures, family dysfunction, and a brilliant but corrupted mind combined to create one of America's most feared criminals. Buckle up. This story begins in 1934 Cincinnati, with a 16-year-old girl and an illegitimate child who would grow up to believe he was both the reincarnation of Jesus Christ and the devil himself. If you're captivated by stories that dig beneath the surface of human nature and explore the forces that shape us, then you'll find a treasure trove of content on Scoob. Available on the App Store and Play Store, Scoob offers a wide range of podcasts that challenge perceptions, ignite curiosity, and reveal the shadows lurking within us all. Dive deeper into the complex layers of humanity, right at your fingertips. Getting back to Charles Manson, let's begin with where it all began: the origin of a monster. November 12, 1934, Cincinnati, Ohio. A 16-year-old girl named Kathleen Maddox gives birth to a son she initially calls No Name. Think about that for a moment. Imagine entering the world so unwanted that your own mother can't even be bothered to give you a name. Charles Manson would later claim his mother was a teenage prostitute, but family members painted a slightly different picture. She was promiscuous, yes, but more accurately described as a wild, outgoing teenager who lived recklessly, drinking heavily, and getting into constant trouble. The distinction might seem minor, but it reveals something crucial about Manson's psychology. Even his earliest memories were filtered through a lens of shame and embellishment. The question of paternity haunted Charles from birth. In 1936, when he was just 2 years old, Kathleen pursued a legal case in Boyd County, Kentucky, against a man identified as Colonel Scott from Ashland, claiming he was Charles's father. The court sided with Kathleen on April 19, 1937, granting her $25 and $5 monthly in child support. But Colonel Scott apparently had other plans. He simply refused to pay, forcing Kathleen to seek wage garnishment by 1940. Charles would grow up claiming he never met his father, carrying the weight of that abandonment his entire life. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Kathleen's idea of motherhood was unconventional, to put it mildly. Relatives recalled how she would drop Charles off with neighbors for an hour, only to vanish for days or weeks at a time. Picture this small boy, constantly shuttled between his grandmother and aunt's homes across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, never knowing where he'd wake up or who would be taking care of him. This wasn't just neglect. This was the systematic destruction of a child's ability to form stable attachments. Every time young Charles began to feel secure somewhere, Kathleen would reappear like a tornado, uprooting him again. The psychological damage was compounding daily. Then came 1939, and the event that would define Charles's understanding of family loyalty forever. Kathleen and her brother Luther decided to rob a gas station in Charleston, West Virginia. But this wasn't some sophisticated heist. They incapacitated the attendant using Coke bottles. Coke bottles! The sheer brutality and stupidity of it reveals everything about the world Charles was born into. They got 5 years for armed robbery. Charles was 5 years old and his mother was heading to prison. While Kathleen served her time, Charles went to live with his aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia. And here's where we encounter one of the most fascinating contradictions in Manson's development: his relationship with organized religion, and his grandmother, Nancy. Nancy Maddox was a devout member of the Nazarene Church, a fundamentalist denomination that preached strict moral codes and complete submission to God's will. For Charles to stay with his grandmother, there was one non-negotiable rule. He had to attend Sunday morning services at the Nazarene Church located directly across from her home. Picture this small boy, dressed in a shirt and tie every Sunday, sitting on those rigid wooden pews beside his grandmother. The discomfort was intentional. Those pews were designed to keep you awake, to make sure you absorbed every word of the minister's fire and brimstone sermons. Charles, with his exceptional memory, quickly memorized vivid passages from the book of Revelation, particularly the descriptions of the bottomless pit. These apocalyptic images would later resurface in his twisted ideology. The Nazarene Church taught several doctrines that would profoundly influence Charles's worldview. The complete inerrancy of Scripture, the submission of women to men, and most importantly, the instruction from Thessalonians to relinquish all individuality, pride, and possessions. For a boy already struggling with identity and abandonment, these messages were psychological dynamite. But here's where Charles's manipulative nature first emerged. While he dutifully attended services with his grandmother, his behavior in Sunday school told a different story. Away from Nancy's watchful eyes, he was restless, defiant, slouching in his seat with his feet propped up on the pew in front of him. He even carved his initials into the wooden bench, a small act of rebellion that speaks volumes about his relationship with authority. Charles desperately wanted to fit in with the other teenagers, but his approach was catastrophically wrong. Instead of downplaying his delinquent past, he boasted about it. He told stories of fights in reform school, evading law enforcement, and most damaging of all, extensive drug use. Remember, this was small-town West Virginia in the 1940s. These kids had never even heard the word marijuana, let alone harder substances. The result was predictable and devastating. The Nazarene teenagers, instead of being impressed, were confused and frightened by his stories. They collectively decided to exclude him from their group. During a Halloween party, a costume party, and hot dog cookout at one of the girls' homes, Charles arrived dressed as a carnival barker, complete with an arm garter and large black hat. He was ready to participate, ready to belong. The rejection was swift and cruel. Except for the embarrassed hostess and her cousin, none of the kids spoke to him. He gamely posed for photographs, but the message was crystal clear. You don't belong here. This rejection spread beyond the church group, contaminating his relationships with all the respectable teenagers in McMecken. Charles understood and accepted his role as a social outcast. But acceptance doesn't mean forgiveness, and this early experience of systematic social rejection would fuel his later hatred of conventional society and his need to create his own family of misfits and outcasts. Fate has a way of providing exactly the wrong influence at exactly the wrong time. And for Charles Manson, that influence came in the form of Clarence Willis, known around town as Cowboy for his ever-present Stetson hat. Cowboy Willis was McMecken's own scandal. He'd divorced his wife, Virginia, abandoned his 3 daughters and 1 son, and moved into a small apartment in town while his ex-wife remarried. But here's what made Cowboy particularly dangerous as a role model. He maintained friendly relations with his ex-wife and children, which somehow softened the town's judgment of his abandonment. This was Charles's first lesson in how to maintain a veneer of respectability while living an entirely selfish life. Cowboy worked for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, but spent his weekends at Wheeling Downs, making small bets and usually losing. It was during one of these gambling excursions that he encountered the socially ostracized Charles Manson. Why did Cowboy take an interest in this rejected teenager? Perhaps he recognized a kindred spirit, another outsider, another person who'd been cast out by respectable society. Or maybe he simply enjoyed having someone who looked up to him. Whatever the reason, Cowboy introduced Charles to his own children, essentially welcoming him into his makeshift family. But the most significant aspect of this relationship wasn't what Cowboy taught Charles directly. It was what Charles observed. Here was a man who'd abandoned his family responsibilities, but still maintained relationships with his children. Here was someone who could compartmentalize his life, appearing respectable while living entirely for his own pleasure. For a teenage boy already struggling with concepts of family, loyalty, and responsibility, Cowboy Willis provided a dangerous blueprint. You could have your cake and eat it too. You could abandon your obligations while still maintaining the appearance of caring. This lesson would prove crucial in Charles's later ability to manipulate his followers into believing he loved them while using them for his own purposes. Summer 1943. Kathleen Maddox, now released from prison, stood at what she believed was a crossroads. She'd spent the past year in a tumultuous cycle, released from jail, engaged but not married, arrested again but not convicted, and struggling desperately to manage her increasingly unruly 9-year-old son. Charles was becoming impossible to control. His behavior was deteriorating rapidly, manifesting in petty theft and constant defiance. Kathleen recognized that her drinking was part of the problem, so she made a decision that showed remarkable self-awareness. She began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. At one of these meetings, she met Louis, a 27-year-old man with his own troubled past. Louis's mother had died when he was 5, and his father had served time in the same Moundsville prison where Kathleen and her brother had been incarcerated. Recently discharged from the Army under circumstances that suggested less than exemplary service, Louis was working in a circus's property department. On paper, Louis was hardly ideal husband material. But Kathleen wasn't looking for a fairy tale. She was looking for stability, for a male figure who might help control Charles's behavior. In August 1943, they married in St. Clairsville, Ohio, just across the river from McMecken, suggesting that family members might have attended as Kathleen attempted to rebuild those broken relationships. Here's what's fascinating about this period. Kathleen actually succeeded in controlling her drinking through AA, but Louis didn't. From the very beginning of their marriage, Louis presented as many problems as Charles did. He drank heavily, couldn't maintain steady employment, and showed no real interest in raising his stepson despite his pre-wedding promises. But Louis offered something Kathleen had never experienced before, a desire for long-term commitment. Unlike her previous partners, Colonel Scott, William Manson, James Roby, and an unidentified fiancé from New York, Louis actually wanted to stay married. For a woman who'd spent her life being abandoned, this was uncharted territory, and she was determined to make it work. The problem was Charles. His behavior continued to deteriorate as he stole from stores and from their home. When confronted, he denied everything and blamed others, primarily Kathleen herself and occasionally Louis. His reasoning was perversely logical. Since Louis often reprimanded him unfairly anyway, he might as well commit the acts he was being accused of. Charles's truancy became legendary among Charleston's officers, yet no threats or incentives could alter his course. He was developing a pattern that would define his entire life. When faced with authority or expectations, he would rebel, rationalize his rebellion, and then blame others for forcing him into bad behavior. This period reveals something crucial about Manson's psychology. He was never truly the victim of circumstances he claimed to be. Even as a 9-year-old, he was making calculated decisions to rebel, steal, and manipulate. His troubled home life was real, but his response to it was a choice that revealed an already formed antisocial personality. By 1947, 13-year-old Charles had become too much for anyone to handle. His mother's attempt to place him in foster care failed due to lack of availability, so the court made a decision that would prove catastrophic. They sent him to the Gibeau School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana. Gibeau was supposed to be different, a residential institution focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. But Charles lasted barely 10 months before fleeing to Indianapolis. This time, however, he didn't run home to his mother. Instead, he showed the first signs of genuine criminal ingenuity, breaking into small stores at night and rifling through cash registers for enough money to rent a room. Think about that for a moment. A 13-year-old boy looking even younger than his age, somehow finding landlords willing to rent to him with no questions asked. This tells us something important about the world Charles was navigating. It was full of people who operated outside the bounds of respectable society. But Charles pushed his luck too far. During another burglary attempt, he was caught, and this time the justice system took control of his fate. A sympathetic judge, noting Charles's previous stay at Gibeau and mistakenly assuming he was Catholic, assigned him to the most famous juvenile facility in America, Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska. Boys Town, established by Father Edward J. Flanagan and immortalized in a popular film starring Spencer Tracy and Mickey Rooney, represented America's best hope for rehabilitating troubled youth. If any place could save Charles Manson, it should have been Boys Town. He lasted 4 days. On his 4th day, Charles and a fellow student named Blackie Nielsen stole a car and headed for Peoria, Illinois, where Blackie's uncle, a professional thief, lived. But this wasn't just a joyride. On their way to Peoria, these 13-year-old boys somehow acquired a gun and committed 2 armed robberies, one at a grocery store and another at a casino. Stop and consider the magnitude of this escalation. In the span of a few weeks, Charles had gone from burglary to armed robbery. This wasn't the desperate act of a confused child. This was a calculated embrace of serious criminal behavior. In Peoria, under the tutelage of Blackie's uncle, Charles essentially became a character from Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist, learning the finer points of theft and criminal survival. But his criminal education was cut short after just 2 weeks when he was caught during a nighttime robbery attempt. The investigation revealed his involvement in the 2 armed robberies, and this time no sympathetic judge stepped forward. Charles was sent to the Indiana Boys School in Plainfield, a true reform school where over 400 young offenders, aged 10 to 21, were housed together. Many were there for serious offenses like armed robbery and manslaughter. The Indiana Boys School was where Charles Manson's childhood officially ended and his criminal education truly began. The environment was brutal beyond imagination. Physical punishment was routine, paddling, duck walking, while crouched with hands holding ankles, and table bending in painful positions. Even well-behaved boys were forced into physical labor on local farms for minimal pay. But the real education came from the older inmates who preyed on younger, weaker boys. For someone like Charles, undersized, vulnerable, and alone, survival meant learning to navigate a world where violence and sexual abuse were constant threats. Charles later claimed he was raped almost immediately upon arrival, supposedly with the encouragement of a sadistic staff member. Whether or not this specific claim is true, it's almost certain that Charles was subjected to sexual exploitation. His later disturbingly detached attitude toward rape, describing it as something to simply clean off rather than a profound violation, suggests deep psychological damage from this period. This is where the truly dangerous aspects of Manson's personality crystallized. The lying, intimidation, and manipulation that had worked in his previous environments were useless here among seasoned young criminals. He had to develop new survival strategies, and those strategies would serve as the foundation for his later ability to control and exploit others. The Indiana Boys School didn't rehabilitate Charles Manson. It completed his transformation from a troubled, abandoned child into a calculating predator who understood that survival required the ability to manipulate, intimidate, and, when necessary, submit to more powerful forces while planning his own eventual dominance. By 1956, 21-year-old Charles Manson faced a moment that would define his future. He had an outstanding legal issue with a stolen car, requiring him to appear in court in Los Angeles. The charges weren't particularly serious. Courts would probably just extend his probation. But Charles panicked and fled to Indianapolis with his wife Rosalie and their newborn son, Charles Manson Jr. That decision changed everything. When he was inevitably captured on March 14th, Charles found himself sentenced to 3 years at Terminal Island Federal Penitentiary in San Pedro, California. At 21, he was finally too old for reform school and would experience adult prison for the first time. Terminal Island was designated for low-risk, nonviolent offenders. But it was still a federal prison with its own rigid hierarchy dominated by older, long-term convicts. Charles quickly realized that his usual tactics wouldn't work here. Instead of immediate manipulation or rebellion, he chose a different strategy: observation. And what he observed changed him forever. Charles became fascinated by the white-collar criminals, but he recognized that embezzlement and large-scale fraud were beyond his capabilities. Instead, he gravitated toward the pimps, much as he had been intrigued by prostitutes in Wheeling years earlier. The pimps at Terminal Island were willing to share their knowledge, and Charles proved to be an eager student. They taught him the art of psychological manipulation, how to identify women with self-esteem issues or father figure problems, how to isolate them from their support systems, and most crucially, how to establish dominance through a carefully calibrated mix of kindness and coercion. The experienced pimps shared sophisticated psychological insights. They warned against targeting women who were too mentally unstable, as they would require constant emotional management rather than generating income. The key was finding the perfect balance, pushing women just far enough to ensure loyalty mixed with fear, but not so far that they became completely dysfunctional. Charles absorbed every lesson. This wasn't casual conversation for him. This was graduate-level education in human manipulation. He was learning how to identify vulnerabilities, exploit emotional needs, and maintain control through psychological rather than physical dominance. His early behavior at Terminal Island showed promise for rehabilitation. He received regular visits from Rosalie and baby Charles Jr., and his mother Kathleen also visited occasionally. Having visitors elevated his status among other inmates, feeding his constant need for attention and validation. Prison officials noted that his work performance improved significantly as his first parole hearing approached, suggesting he could exercise self-discipline when properly motivated. This gave hope that he might serve only a fraction of his 3-year sentence. But Charles wasn't using this time to prepare for a law-abiding life outside prison. He was using it to perfect the psychological tools that would later enable him to build his family of devoted followers. Every conversation with the pimps, every observation of prison hierarchy, every lesson in manipulation was being carefully cataloged for future use. The most chilling aspect of this period is how methodically Charles approached his criminal education. He wasn't just randomly absorbing influences, he was actively seeking out knowledge that would make him more effective at controlling others. Terminal Island didn't reform Charles Manson. It provided him with a postgraduate degree in psychological manipulation. In June 1961, 26-year-old Charles Manson arrived at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in Washington's Puget Sound, facing a 10-year sentence for check forgery. He had already spent close to 14 years in various forms of custody, and McNeil Island would provide the final elements of his criminal and spiritual education. McNeil Island was vastly different from Terminal Island. Spanning over 2,000 acres of rugged terrain, it operated largely as a self-sufficient community with an inmate-tended farm, ferry access, and even homes for prison staff and their families. About 1,000 prisoners were housed in a 5-tier cell block, representing a mix of white-collar criminals, petty hustlers, and hardened felons. Staff evaluations noted that Charles appeared energetic and articulate, using skills he'd learned from a Dale Carnegie course at Terminal Island. He could use expressive gestures and dramatize situations to captivate his audience. But underneath this polished exterior, evaluators detected loneliness, resentment, and hostility. Ironically, Charles admitted feeling relieved upon arriving at McNeil. Institutional life had become his default existence, providing a security unavailable to him in the outside world. But more importantly, Charles viewed incarceration as an educational opportunity, and McNeil Island offered knowledge he'd never encountered before. While considerable numbers of born-again Christians tried to convert him, Charles had little interest in their spiritual overtures. Instead, his fascination was captured by the Scientologists at McNeil Island. This group intrigued him not necessarily for their spiritual doctrines, but for their unique communication methods and practices. Scientology, founded by L. Ron Hubbard, offered sophisticated techniques for mental manipulation disguised as spiritual enlightenment. The Scientologists taught concepts like auditing, a process of controlled questioning designed to uncover and exploit psychological vulnerabilities. They spoke of clearing the mind of negative influences and achieving higher states of consciousness through specific mental exercises. For Charles, Scientology wasn't a path to spiritual enlightenment. It was an advanced course in psychological control. The Scientologists provided him with a pseudo-scientific vocabulary for manipulation, teaching him how to identify reactive behavior in others and how to guide people toward desired mental states. But Charles wasn't content with just one source of esoteric knowledge. He found fellow inmates eager to share information about black magic, white magic, and hypnotism. This wasn't casual interest. Charles was systematically acquiring every tool of mental manipulation available to him. The combination of Scientology techniques, occult practices, and hypnotic methods gave Charles an incredibly sophisticated toolkit for psychological control. He was learning how to present manipulation as spiritual enlightenment, how to use pseudo-scientific language to legitimize his control over others, and how to tap into people's deepest spiritual longings for his own purposes. Think about what Charles was becoming during this period. A man who could speak the language of religion, psychology, and spirituality, while using all three to manipulate and control others. He was developing the ability to present himself as a spiritual teacher, while systematically breaking down his followers' psychological defenses. McNeil Island completed Charles Manson's transformation from a simple criminal into something far more dangerous, a sophisticated predator who understood how to exploit humanity's deepest spiritual and psychological needs. When he finally left prison, he would be armed with knowledge that would enable him to build not just a criminal organization, but a devoted cult of followers willing to kill for him. By the time Charles Manson emerged from prison in the late 1960s, he carried with him a complex mixture of influences, but perhaps none more sinister than his fascination with Adolf Hitler. Manson didn't just admire Hitler. He studied him, spoke of him with fervor, and ultimately attempted to recreate his methods on American soil. The parallels between these two men are both striking and terrifying. Both were of small stature, both adhered to vegetarian diets, and both were marked by profound psychological trauma in their early lives. Manson bore the stigma of illegitimacy from his own birth, while Hitler carried the shame of his father's illegitimate origins. This shared experience of social rejection and alienation contributed to their intense hatred of societal norms. Both men lived as nomadic wanderers, both faced rejection in their artistic aspirations, and both showed a notable preference for animals over people. They shared an intense interest in the occult, and most significantly, both directed others to carry out killings rather than committing murders themselves. Despite their racist ideologies, both men were reportedly tormented by the possibility of harboring the heritage of the very races they despised. Historians suggest Hitler may have feared having Jewish ancestry, while prison records indicate Manson might have believed his father was black. This internal conflict may have intensified their hatred of those they saw as inferior. But the most chilling similarities lay in their leadership methods. Both were masters at identifying and exploiting weaknesses in others, surrounding themselves with subservient followers who they programmed through constant repetition and fear. Hitler used the term Schweinehund for his enemies. Manson called them pigs. Both men possessed eyes that followers described as hypnotic, and both exuded an undeniable charisma that could convert opponents into devoted supporters. Manson spoke of Hitler with admiration, claiming that the Nazi leader was attuned to cosmic truths and had redressed Jewish karma through the Holocaust. This wasn't casual conversation. Manson was studying Hitler's methods and adapting them for his own purposes. The philosophical foundation for both men's beliefs came largely from Friedrich Nietzsche's concepts of male supremacy, racial superiority, and the justification of murder for a supposedly greater good. They both executed mass murder as integral to achieving their grand visions: Hitler's Third Reich and Manson's apocalyptic race war called Helter Skelter. What makes this connection so disturbing is how consciously Manson borrowed from Hitler's playbook. He understood that Hitler had successfully manipulated an entire nation into supporting genocide, and he believed he could replicate that success on a smaller scale in America. The question that haunted investigators was simple. If Manson had been given the opportunity, would he have attempted to match the scale of Hitler's atrocities? The evidence suggests the answer is yes. Manson's ultimate goal wasn't just to commit murder. It was to trigger a race war that would destroy American society and leave him in a position of ultimate power. Like Hitler, he saw himself as the architect of a new world order, one that would emerge from the ashes of the old society he sought to destroy. In the spring of 1968, when Greg Jacobson first met Charles Manson, the future cult leader was already discussing the prospect of a black-white racial conflict. Manson used the phrase, "the shit is coming down," street terminology for an impending reckoning or chaos. But at this point, according to Jacobson, Manson wasn't particularly fixated on racial warfare. It was just one of many topics they discussed. Paul Watkins, another early acquaintance, remembered meeting Manson in June 1968. Even then, Manson's apocalyptic ideology wasn't fully formed. He spoke casually about racial divisions, suggesting that when the shit hit, black and white people would be in opposition. But this was merely conversational speculation, not the obsessive doctrine it would become. Everything changed in December 1968, when the Beatles released their White Album. The album contained a song called Helter Skelter, which was simply about a carnival slide in England. But Manson, with his ability to find hidden meanings in everything, heard something entirely different. The lyrics spoke of coming down fast, of chaos and confusion, and to Manson's twisted mind, this was clearly a message about societal collapse and racial warfare. After a trip to Los Angeles, away from Barker Ranch where his followers lived, Manson returned to Death Valley on December 31, 1968, with a revelation. He told his family that the Beatles were delivering a direct message about an upcoming upheaval. He replaced crude street terminology with Helter Skelter, transforming a song about playground equipment into a prophecy of apocalyptic racial war. The transformation in Manson's obsession was immediate and total. Paul Watkins recalled how the group began listening to the White Album incessantly, with Manson extracting apocalyptic meaning from every track. He interpreted the album as prophecy that black people would rise up and destroy cities in a massive racial uprising. By January 1969, the family had relocated to a house at 20,910 Gresham Street in Canoga Park, which Manson dubbed the Yellow Submarine after the Beatles movie. Like a submerged vessel, members weren't allowed to leave, but could only view the outside world through windows. This physical isolation intensified their psychological dependence on Manson's interpretations of reality. During this period, they began extensive preparations for the coming apocalypse, designing dune buggies and motorcycles, planning to acquire Harley-Davidson bikes, and establishing escape routes to desert supply caches. Watkins noted how meticulously Manson crafted his vision, deliberately and carefully molding it into something all-consuming. Prior to the Helter Skelter obsession, Watkins remembered that Manson was more focused on free love activities and sexual experimentation. But once the Beatles album provided him with an apocalyptic framework, everything changed. Helter Skelter became the central organizing principle of his belief system, the lens through which everything else was interpreted. The most chilling aspect of this transformation is how a simple misinterpretation of popular music became the justification for multiple murders. When Manson's followers later killed Sharon Tate and others, they scrawled Helter Skelter in blood at one of the crime scenes, directly connecting their violence to Manson's twisted interpretation of a Beatles song. This reveals something crucial about Manson's psychology. He had an almost supernatural ability to take innocuous cultural references and transform them into justifications for evil. A song about a playground slide became a call to murder. A movie about a yellow submarine became a metaphor for psychological isolation. Popular music became a secret code that only he could decipher. The Beatles never intended to inspire violence, but Manson's genius lay in his ability to find what he needed in whatever material was available. If it hadn't been Helter Skelter, it would have been something else. His followers wanted meaning, purpose, and spiritual guidance, and Manson was brilliant at providing those things while simultaneously leading them toward increasingly destructive behavior. If stories that unravel the dark intersections of psychology, spirituality, and human nature fascinate you, Scoob is the place to explore more. Available on the App Store and Play Store, Scoob offers podcasts that peel back layers of the human mind, revealing the disturbing and mysterious forces shaping notorious figures like Manson, Bundy, and more. But let's get back to Manson, arguably the most chilling example of manipulation turned into a movement. By 1967, Charles Manson had emerged from prison with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and an arsenal of manipulation techniques acquired from pimps, Scientologists, and fellow criminals. But his true genius lay in his ability to synthesize these influences into a coherent system for attracting and controlling followers. Until his capture in Mendocino County on July 28, 1967, he went by his legal name, Charles Mills Manson. But occasionally, he referred to himself as Charles Willis Manson, and eventually developed an even more grandiose interpretation. He would say with deliberate slowness that his name was Charles Will is man's son, suggesting that his will was aligned with that of the Son of Man, a ready-made claim to divinity. Manson extended this messianic persona by telling his followers that they were the reincarnations of the original Christians, while contemporary authorities were the modern-day Romans. In his twisted theology, it was now the Romans' turn to face crucifixion. This wasn't random religious babbling. It was a carefully constructed narrative that gave his followers a sense of historical significance and divine purpose. His approach to recruitment was methodical and tailored to each individual's specific vulnerabilities. With female recruits, he often began with sexual encounters. But these weren't random hookups. He would study each woman first, identifying her particular psychological needs. If she lacked confidence, he would convince her of her extraordinary beauty. If she had daddy issues, he would position himself as a father figure. If she was seeking spiritual leadership, he would present himself as a Christ-like teacher. The case of Susan Atkins perfectly illustrates his methods. When they met at a house party where he was playing guitar, Manson immediately recognized her vulnerability. After their sexual encounter, Susan was reportedly almost lifeless, murmuring his name repeatedly. She later compared Manson to Jesus, claiming that minutes after meeting him, she knelt to kiss his feet. This wasn't love, it was psychological capture. For male recruits, Manson typically initiated shared LSD experiences using the drug-induced vulnerability to discuss concepts of love, self-abnegation, and the dissolution of individual ego in favor of cosmic unity. During these altered states, he could plant ideas and reshape thought patterns with remarkable effectiveness. Manson's philosophical arsenal drew from multiple sources. Scientology provided him with techniques for mental manipulation disguised as spiritual practice. The Bible gave him messianic authority and apocalyptic imagery, and Beatles music offered contemporary cultural relevance. But there was a fourth influence that investigators found particularly disturbing. Old magazines at Barker Ranch suggested Manson claimed familiarity with Nietzsche's works and believed in concepts of racial superiority that paralleled Hitler's ideology. The synthesis of these influences created a unique and powerful form of mind control. Manson could speak the language of spirituality while using Scientology techniques to break down psychological barriers. He could quote scripture while advocating violence. He could discuss love and peace while planning murder. His followers weren't stupid or inherently evil. They were psychologically captured by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their deepest needs and vulnerabilities. Manson provided them with meaning, purpose, family, and spiritual guidance, while gradually reshaping their moral framework to accept increasingly extreme behavior. The terrifying efficiency of his methods is demonstrated by how quickly he could transform seemingly normal young people into devoted followers willing to commit murder. Susan Atkins went from meeting him at a party to participating in the brutal Tate murders in less than 2 years. This wasn't gradual corruption. It was systematic psychological programming by someone who had spent decades studying human manipulation. Summer 1967. A house party somewhere in California. Charles Manson sits with his guitar, performing for a small audience. Among the listeners is a young woman named Susan Atkins, searching for meaning in a world that seems to offer nothing but disappointment and confusion. According to Manson's later accounts, Susan introduced herself by expressing admiration for his music. What happened next reveals everything about Manson's predatory genius and Susan's psychological vulnerability. They moved to her room, where they engaged in a sexual encounter that left Susan in an almost catatonic state, repeatedly murmuring Manson's name. This wasn't passion, it was psychological capture. Susan later described the experience as meeting her personal Jesus, claiming that within minutes of their encounter, she knelt to kiss his feet. For a young woman struggling with identity and purpose, Manson provided instant meaning and direction. He didn't just offer her love, he offered her a role in a cosmic drama. Shortly after this meeting, Susan relocated to Southern California with Manson, joining what would become known as the Manson Family. They established themselves at Spahn Movie Ranch, a former filming location for westerns that had fallen into disrepair. The isolated location was perfect for Manson's purposes. Cut off from mainstream society, his followers became increasingly dependent on him for guidance and validation. Manson renamed Susan Sadie Mae Glutz, stripping away her previous identity and replacing it with something of his own creation. This wasn't just a nickname. It was a form of psychological ownership. By giving her a new name, He was essentially creating a new person, one who owed her very existence to him. In 1968, Susan gave birth to a son. Despite Manson not being the father, he convinced her to name the child Zizazos Zadfrak Glutz, a deliberately bizarre name that served multiple purposes. It further separated the child from conventional society, ensured that the unusual name would bind the family closer together through shared uniqueness, and demonstrated Manson's complete control over even the most intimate family decisions. But this domestic strangeness was merely the beginning. As the family's drug-dealing operations failed to provide sufficient income, and as Manson's apocalyptic visions intensified, Susan found herself drawn into increasingly violent activities. The first major crime came when Manson learned that an acquaintance, Gary Hinman, had supposedly inherited money. Manson dispatched Susan and 2 others to extract this money from Hinman. The result was murder. Gary Hinman was killed during what was supposed to be a simple robbery. This marked Susan's first direct involvement in killing. A line that once crossed became easier to cross again. The connection between Susan's nickname and the Beatles' White Album reveals Manson's sophisticated manipulation techniques. The album contained a song called Sexy Sadie, which Manson claimed was a direct reference to Susan's new identity as Sadie Mae Glutz. Despite the song's frivolous nature, Manson convinced his followers that the Beatles were speaking directly to them through their music. This delusion culminated on August 8, 1969, when Manson dispatched Susan and 4 other followers to the home of actress Sharon Tate with explicit instructions to create a scene more grotesque than anything that had come before. The group brutally murdered 5 people, including the pregnant Sharon Tate, whose unborn child died from asphyxiation. The very next night, Manson's followers attacked another couple, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, in their Los Angeles home. The LaBiancas were similarly murdered with extreme brutality and their bodies mutilated. After committing these horrific murders, the killers lingered at the crime scene, calmly preparing snacks for themselves and scrawling messages like "Death to all pigs," "Helter Skelter," and "Arise on the walls with blood." This wasn't the behavior of people acting in passionate fury. This was the calculated follow-through of individuals who had been psychologically programmed to see murder as necessary and even righteous. Susan's transformation from a young woman seeking meaning to a cold-blooded killer illustrates the horrifying effectiveness of Manson's manipulation techniques. She didn't gradually become evil. She was systematically reprogrammed to believe that murder was a form of spiritual service, that she was participating in a cosmic war between good and evil, and that Charles Manson was her guide to salvation. The most chilling aspect of Susan's story is how completely she surrendered her individual moral judgment to Manson's authority. She participated in torture and murder not because she enjoyed violence, but because she had been convinced that these acts served a higher purpose. This is the ultimate goal of cult manipulation: to replace individual conscience with absolute dependence on the leader's moral framework. As we reach the end of this psychological journey through Charles Manson's development, we're left with a disturbing question. How does a neglected child from Ohio become one of America's most feared criminals? The answer lies not in any single traumatic event, but in the systematic accumulation of influences, experiences, and choices that shaped Manson's worldview. Every abandoned night with his grandmother, every rejection by the Nazarene teenagers, every day in reform school, every conversation with pimps and Scientologists, all of these experiences contributed to the creation of a perfect predator. Manson's genius wasn't in his originality, but in his synthesis. He took manipulation techniques from pimps, psychological control methods from Scientologists, messianic authority from Christianity, apocalyptic imagery from the Bible, cultural relevance from popular music, and racial hatred from Nazi ideology. The result was a unique and terrifying form of charismatic leadership that could transform lost young people into devoted killers. The murders that shocked America in 1969 weren't random acts of violence. They were the inevitable result of Manson's carefully constructed belief system, meeting vulnerable followers willing to surrender their individual moral judgment. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and the other family members weren't born evil. They were methodically programmed by someone who understood exactly how to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Manson story is how preventable it might have been. At multiple points in his development, intervention might have changed the trajectory of his life. If Kathleen had been a more stable mother, if the Nazarene teenagers had shown him acceptance, if the reform schools had focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment, if prison officials had recognized the dangerous knowledge he was acquiring, any of these interventions might have prevented the creation of a monster. Instead, every institution that encountered Charles Manson failed him, and by extension, failed his future victims. The child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, the adult prison system, and even religious institutions all contributed to his criminal education rather than his rehabilitation. The Manson case serves as a stark reminder that evil isn't born in a vacuum. It's created through a complex interaction of personal choice, social failure, and systemic neglect. Charles Manson chose to become what he became, but that choice was shaped by decades of experiences that taught him that manipulation, violence, and control were the only reliable paths to getting what he wanted. Today, Charles Manson is dead, having spent the last decades of his life in prison, still trying to manipulate anyone who would listen. His followers are either dead in prison or elderly women trying to rebuild lives shattered by their involvement with a man who convinced them that murder was a form of love. But the lessons of the Manson case remain relevant. In our current era of social media manipulation, political polarization, and cultural fragmentation, the techniques Manson used to control his followers, isolation from mainstream society, creation of us versus them mentalities, exploitation of spiritual seeking, and the gradual normalization of extreme behavior, are being employed by various groups and individuals seeking to exert control over others. Understanding how Charles Manson was created isn't just an exercise in criminal psychology. It's a warning about the ongoing vulnerability of lost, searching individuals to those who would exploit their need for meaning, belonging, and purpose. The story of Charles Manson is ultimately a story about the power of influence, the importance of critical thinking, and the deadly consequences that can result when damaged people encounter those who would use their pain for destructive purposes. As we conclude this deep dive into one of America's most notorious criminals, remember that the capacity for both good and evil exists within all of us. The choices we make, the influences we accept, and the values we embrace determine which path we follow. Charles Manson made his choices, and the world is still dealing with the consequences. Episodes like this, where we deep dive into the shadows of the human mind and confront the origins of darkness, are just the beginning. If you're drawn to the unsettling truths behind human behavior and crave stories that haunt long after they end, then Scoob is your gateway. Available on the App Store and Play Store. Scoob is where you can explore stories that don't shy away from the uncomfortable, the mysterious, and the deeply disturbing. Thank you for joining me on this disturbing but necessary journey through the making of a monster. If this episode has taught us anything, it's that evil isn't born. It's created through a complex interaction of choice, circumstance, and social failure. Next time on the Serial Killer Files, we'll explore another case of how psychological manipulation and charismatic evil can transform ordinary people into instruments of destruction. Until then, stay vigilant, think critically, and remember, understanding evil is the first step toward preventing it.